The first helicopter crew to reach Recon Team Pennsylvania could see the problem from above. The team was alive. The radios still worked. Aircraft were overhead, and there was nowhere close enough to put a Huey. That was March 24, 1970, in Ratanakiri Province, Cambodia. Jerry Poole and Recon Team Pennsylvania had men behind them, aircraft above them, and a piece of jungle between the two that would not cooperate. The report reduces the problem to one sentence. There was no landing zone nearby. That sounds almost harmless until you picture what it meant. A helicopter could be close enough for the men on the ground to hear it and still be unable to take them out. The team had to keep moving, and the helicopters had to keep waiting. I want to straighten out one point right up front, because the title makes the geography sound cleaner than it was. Pennsylvania was not standing with one boot on the international border. The loss record places the team roughly 14 miles inside Cambodia. They were well across the fence. The real problem was worse than reaching a line on a map. They had reached the point where getting back depended on finding one small patch of ground that aircraft could actually use, while an enemy force kept closing the distance. That is the story. Not what MACV-SOG was in general. Not every kind of cross-border mission. Not a catalog of secret equipment. One team. One day. A shrinking number of ways out. Recon Team Pennsylvania had 3 Americans and 5 indigenous commandos. Poole was the team leader. John Boronski was with him. Gary Harned was the radio operator. Their assignment had taken them into Ratanakiri, an area of steep country and heavy jungle, where seeing a place on a map and reaching it on foot were 2 different things. The team had been found soon after insertion. By the time the extraction effort developed, they had already spent a long time trying to stay ahead of the force following them. Accounts from the men and aviators describe the pursuit as relentless. When Pennsylvania stopped, the enemy closed. When Pennsylvania moved, the pressure followed. There was no clean break, where everybody could take 5 minutes and work out a better plan. And that is important, because an extraction point is not useful just because somebody once circled it on a map. The ground has to work. The aircraft has to be able to reach it. The crew has to be able to see enough to make the approach. The team has to get there before the situation changes again. At Pennsylvania's location, those things would not line up. James Lake was flying red lead for the 170th Assault Helicopter Company. Michael O'Donnell was flying red 3. Their crews came in with Cobra gunships and other air support already working the problem. Lake had experience with these missions. He had also helped put Pennsylvania into the area. Now he was looking down at a team that could not simply walk into the first opening beneath the aircraft. There wasn't one. So, the slicks stayed high while the team moved. That is a strange kind of waiting. The men on the ground are trying to reach the aircraft. The aircraft are waiting for the men to reach ground the aircraft can use. Everybody is getting closer to the same place, and nobody can force the timing. If you were around remote helicopter operations in Vietnam, especially in country where the maps hit a lot of vertical ground, you probably know how misleading the word LZ can sound 50 years later. On paper, it is 2 letters. In the aircraft, it was a real piece of terrain with real limits. I would be interested in hearing which part official reports usually made sounds simpler than you remember it. The terrain, visibility, enemy fire, or the time it took to get everybody into the same place. Pennsylvania kept moving. The helicopters kept orbiting. And the clock that mattered next was not on the ground. It was in the fuel tanks. Lake later described watching the team's progress while calculating how long his aircraft could remain over the area. He had a little more than an hour of fuel left when the extraction aircraft reached the scene. That sounds like time. It was not much time. The team was not standing beside an LZ waiting for pickup. They had to get down through steep ground and continue toward a valley where an extraction might be possible. The aircraft could not hover over Cambodia, forever waiting for that to happen. At some point, somebody had to leave. That is where this story changes. The enemy had already taken away the easy ground. The jungle had taken away the nearby landing zone. Now fuel began taking away the helicopters. Lake made the decision to head back toward DAC 2 to refuel and bring more aircraft into the extraction effort. O'Donnell stayed on station as long as he could. Think about that from Poole's side of the radio. You have aircraft overhead, which means for a moment, the whole problem feels closer to being solved. Then, one of those aircraft has to leave because it is running out of the one thing nobody on the ground can give it. The men behind Pennsylvania do not need to understand aviation endurance. They only need the helicopters to stay. They do not stay. Not all of them. And nothing on the ground pauses while Red Lead goes for fuel. Gary Harned's job makes that waiting easier to understand. Harned was the team's radio operator. In a story like this, the radio is easy to treat as background because it never becomes the biggest object in the scene. But nearly every outside decision depended on what could be passed through it. The aircraft could see the general country. They could not see Pennsylvania the way Pennsylvania could see itself. The team knew how close the pursuit felt. The aircrews knew how much fuel they had, what support was available, and what the terrain looked like from above. Those two pictures had to meet over the radio. That is why a message such as, "They are right behind us," matters more than it looks on paper. It was not decoration. It changed the aircraft problem. A crew that might otherwise wait for the rest of the package now had to decide whether the team would still be there when everybody arrived. The radio did not make the situation safer. It made the shrinking margin visible to people who could not stand beside Poole and look over his shoulder. And Harned had to keep that link alive while the team moved. I have read plenty of Vietnam reports where communications are reduced to a phrase like, "contact maintained." That wording is useful for a staff summary. It is almost useless for understanding the men inside the event. Contact maintained can mean the difference between an aircraft circling a patch of jungle and an aircraft knowing that a team has 10 minutes left. It can mean a pilot learning that the planned pickup is no longer realistic. It can mean a commander hearing, in somebody else's voice, that the situation on the ground has changed faster than the plan. That was the value of the radio here. Not because it gave Pennsylvania more choices, because it told everybody else how few choices were left. The pursuit keeps moving. The terrain stays steep. Pennsylvania still has to reach the valley. There is another detail in the accounts that tells you what kind of day this had become. The gunships supporting the team were also burning through what they had brought with them. One Cobra had to break away to rearm and refuel after working enemy positions around Pennsylvania. Again, another option gets thinner. A SOG team could have a remarkable amount of American air power trying to help it and still feel very small on the ground. That is one of the contradictions of these missions that broad histories sometimes miss. There could be radios, forward air controllers, gunships, fast movers and slicks all involved in the same recovery. But the final distance still had to be covered by the men on foot. Poole's team could not be lifted from a radio frequency. They had to reach a place where a helicopter could physically take them. And as the team came down toward the valley floor, Poole injured his ankle. That did not create the crisis. The crisis was already there. What it did was remove another little piece of margin. A team that had been moving because it had no choice now had a leader who could not move the same way he had before. The enemy was still close. Fires from the air support were also becoming part of the ground picture, and the extraction aircraft were not all overhead anymore. Poole called for the helicopters. The answer was that they were coming. That exchange is more useful than any dramatic narration I could put around it. They were coming. The team still had to last until they arrived. By then, Lake was racing back from DAC 2 with the extraction package. O'Donnell had remained near the team. The original idea of an orderly pickup had been reduced to something much simpler. Get an aircraft to Pennsylvania before the team lost the ability to reach one. The LZ they were moving toward was not a generous clearing. Accounts describe it near the bottom of a narrow valley with steep walls around it. That is not the kind of detail you add because it sounds dangerous. It matters because it explains the decision. There was no perfect landing zone waiting somewhere just beyond the next ridge. There was an available place. Those are not the same thing. The valley was what they had. And by the time the aircraft came back, Poole was telling the men overhead that the enemy was right behind them. This is the point where I went back and read the aviation accounts more than once, because the timing is easy to lose when everything is compressed into a paragraph. Lake had gone for fuel. More helicopters were being brought in. O'Donnell was still overhead. The team was trying to finish the last movement into the extraction area, and the time that had looked barely manageable from the air was disappearing on the ground. From above, this was a coordination problem. From the ground, it was distance. That difference is worth holding on to. A helicopter crew could talk in minutes of fuel, arrival times, and who was still on station. Poole's team experienced the same period as ground that still had to be crossed. That is why the story does not need a dozen blocked LZs to work. One unusable pickup close to the team was enough. Once that nearby option was gone, everything depended on Pennsylvania reaching another place before the other clocks expired. The enemy clock, the fuel clock, the daylight and visibility the air crews were working with, and the physical condition of the men moving toward the valley. Every one of those clocks belonged to a different person. Only the extraction had to satisfy all of them at once. Poole could see O'Donnell's Huey. That matters. For much of the mission, the helicopter had been something on the radio or above the canopy. Now it was right there. Still not on the ground. Still not carrying them out. There is a famous transmission associated with this moment. Poole challenged O'Donnell to come down and get them immediately. The exact language survives in several retellings, and it is rougher than I need to repeat here. The meaning is enough. We cannot wait. O'Donnell did not wait. Lake and the other aircraft were close, but not yet in position to make the pickup together. O'Donnell took Red 3 down toward the valley. This is where I want to be careful with the word heroic. That word is usually applied after everything is over. Inside the cockpit, the practical fact was that a team on the ground had run out of time. O'Donnell had an aircraft. The aircraft could reach them. So he went. Red 3 came into the extraction area, while support aircraft worked around it. The helicopter held long enough for Pennsylvania to reach it. One by one, the people who had been a moving radio contact in the jungle became passengers. Poole, Boronski, Harned, the 5 indigenous commandos, 8 men. The team was aboard. For a few seconds, the problem the entire day had been built around was solved. There was finally an LZ. There was finally a helicopter in it. There was finally enough time for the team to get on. O'Donnell transmitted that he had the full team and was leaving the area. That is the line you would expect to end this story. It does not. Red 3 began to climb out. Shortly afterward, the aircraft was lost. All of the men aboard were killed. For years, the helicopter and the men associated with that loss remained part of the unresolved accounting from the war. That changes the meaning of everything before it. The long orbit, the fuel calculation, the move toward the valley, the decision not to wait any longer. The LZ that finally became usable. The extraction itself worked. The aircraft got the whole team aboard. And they still did not make it home. There is no useful way to polish that. The official accounting record says the helicopter picked up the patrol and was beginning its ascent when an explosion caused it to crash. Heavy enemy presence prevented an immediate ground investigation. That is what the record can support. Other accounts written later contain more detail about the fire around the aircraft and how the loss occurred, but they are not identical in every point. I do not think the story needs me to make those differences disappear. The thing we know is enough. Pennsylvania had been trapped without a nearby LZ. Air crews stayed with them while the team fought time and terrain to reach one. O'Donnell took Red 3 in when the waiting could not continue. The team got aboard. Then, the aircraft was lost. There is another part of the record that took decades to finish. In 1995, A joint recovery effort reached the crash area and recovered remains associated with the loss. Advances in identification work continued after that. In 2001, the remains of Jerry Poole and Michael O'Donnell were among those identified from the site. The men associated with the loss have since been accounted for. 31 years separates the extraction from that identification. That is longer than any orbit over an LZ, longer than any fuel calculation, longer than anybody in Red 3 could have imagined when the helicopter dropped into that valley. And it leaves us with a very different kind of last coordinate. The wartime loss record gives the grid as YB484,003. On March 24, 1970, that grid meant a place an aircraft was trying to leave. Years later, it became the place search teams had to return to. That is where I would leave this one, not with the claim that every LZ had been blocked. The record is more exact than that. Pennsylvania had no usable landing zone close to the team when the helicopters arrived, and the men had to keep moving under pressure until one bad option became possible. Not safe. Possible. Red 3 got them aboard there. The grid was YB484,003.